This is Richard Burden here, the director of INH, Irish Institute of Nutrition and Health. Many of you know me because you're being past students or present students perhaps as well. So, and so that probably means you had enough of seeing me over the years. So we'll get straight to the point and introduce Amy Berger, who is our very special guest for tonight. She's speaking to us all the way from Virginia, live in the States, so it's very exciting. And this is the biggest webinar we've had so far. We're full up basically with we have over 100 people and wanting to register for this. And so the others will have to pick up the recording afterwards. Just a few words before we start. What's going to happen is Amy's going to make her presentation, and during that time you can put in your questions and comments in the appropriate box there, question box, and then afterwards Amy will work her way through those questions. That's how it works. Okay, so there's no other way to interrupt, and that's how it should be, of course. So so Amy will be able to answer questions at the end of it. So I think Amy's presentation will be less than an hour and a half, so there should be plenty of time for that at the end. Just a note, I suppose, to say why we asked Amy in the first place to do us this favor. It was because I discovered this book, and I'm sure some of you have found this book already. And I found this book some months ago, and I was absolutely delighted when I read it, because immediately I realized just how accessible it was. This is a book that just about anyone can read and understand, and get a lot of practical understanding and practical information to implement the kinds of changes that are needed to deal with Alzheimer's. And of course, what is it, 2 years ago, we had this piece of news that came out, a huge survey done across Europe, which Amy might or might not have heard about. People were asked about what their biggest fears for the future were. And for many, many years now, the biggest fear as people get older is the fear of cancer. And it's changed dramatically now. And people are much more scared of the prospect of developing Alzheimer's disease or some other form of dementia. So this is something that, even if it doesn't affect us now personally or within our close family, I mean, I think we can all relate to this. It will at some point. And so we need to know something about this. And knowing and recognizing that this is a metabolic disease means that we have a handle on it, potentially. We can do something about this. It's related to our diet and lifestyle. And Amy is wonderfully gifted in being able to explain all this and what we need to do in practical ways. So without further ado, as they say, I'm going to hand over to Amy. And thank you very much, Amy, for joining us. And I'll pass over to you now. And Anitra, if you can pass that over to Amy for us. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me, and good evening to everyone in Ireland. I just found out that a personal friend of mine, I think, is among your alumni, among your graduates, and that's Miss Patricia Daly. So I feel like I am among good company here. Thank you for giving me your evening. I will try to give you information that makes it worth it. I am a nutritionist, and I'm also a freelance writer based in the States. And I've come out with my book that Richard showed you called The Alzheimer's Antidote. And a little background about me, just really quickly. I came into the nutrition profession like so many people do, like some of you probably have, in that I tried to take care of my own health and weight issues. And despite following the conventional advice, low-fat diet, lots of exercise, whole grains, no saturated fat, I didn't get anywhere. I fought my weight for most of my childhood and most of my young adult life until I learned about low-carbohydrate nutrition. And the low-carbohydrate way of eating certainly, may not be right for everybody, but it's extremely therapeutic for a huge range of conditions that really have either no other effective treatments, or the treatments are, undesirable. They have bad side effects. And so, I sort of dedicate my career now to trying to help other people learn about the benefits of restricted carbohydrate ways of eating. So let's, without further ado, let's talk about Alzheimer's disease. As we go through this, try to keep one thing in mind that I'm going to say right here. When it comes to conditions like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease or polycystic ovarian syndrome or infertility, we take it for granted that there's a role for diet and lifestyle in those conditions, if not a primary driving role. Nobody questions that anymore. Nobody even questions whether or not your diet and lifestyle influence type 2 diabetes or heart disease. And yet, when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, we just throw our hands up like we're just clueless. We have no idea where this is coming from, right? Alzheimer's disease couldn't possibly be related to diet and lifestyle in the same way that all those other conditions are that have exploded in incidence over the last 50 or 60 years in the same way Alzheimer's has. So just as diet and lifestyle can influence those conditions, I'm here to tell you that diet and lifestyle can influence Alzheimer's. This is not a complete mystery. This is not a completely unknowable illness. There are a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of research remains to be done, but that doesn't mean we are completely clueless. It doesn't mean we have no idea where this is coming from or what to do about it. I think we know a lot more than we think we do. So with that in mind, let's go. I like to say that Alzheimer's disease is a metabolic condition. And by metabolic, I mean it has to do with the brain, with the way the brain produces and uses energy. So think about what happens when you don't have enough energy, when you're tired. You get clumsy, right? You make mistakes you don't normally make. So what do you think happens when the brain gets forgetful or when the brain doesn't have enough energy? So your brain is an energy hog. Even when you're sitting on the couch watching TV and you think you're doing nothing, you think your brain is melting, your brain is actually constantly all the time using a ton of energy. In a typical adult's body, your brain accounts for only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses about 20 to 25% of all the energy in your body. All the glucose and all the oxygen is being consumed by your brain, even at rest. So your brain requires a constant supply of energy and a constant supply of a lot of energy. So anything that disrupts that fuel supply is going to have major, major implications for your cognition, for your memory, for your personality, for your behavior. So I have peppered throughout the presentation some quotations from some scientific studies. If anyone wants links to the studies, you can email me afterward. I can send you the links directly to the studies. When the brain's energy supply is insufficient to meet its metabolic needs, the neurons that work the hardest, especially those concerned with memory and cognition, are among the first to exhibit functional incapacity, that is, impairment of memory and cognitive performance. So remember this as we go through. Alzheimer's disease is a fuel shortage. It's an energy crisis in the brain. So if we're going to talk about the way the brain processes energy and the way that neuronal communication happens, the way cognitive function occurs, we have to have a basic understanding of the neuron structure. There's a lot of different types of cells in the brain, but the neuron is the one that we're primarily concerned with here. Now, if you look at the left of your screen, you have the cell body. That's the main part of the cell that houses the nucleus. And there's a long, thin projection called an axon that comes out of that. And the axon ends in axon terminals. The way that communication happens between these cells in the brain is that a signal is passed out the axon terminals of one neuron and it's received at the dendrites of another. And you can see the dendrites as those sharp little branches coming out of the cell body at the left. Now, think of them like senders and receivers. It's almost like a radio station broadcasting a signal and it has to be received at your home radio. And the axon, as you can see, is covered in something called the myelin sheath. And the way these cells communicate, it's an electrical signal, an electrochemical signal. And just like the electrical cords from an appliance in your home, the axon has to be grounded. It has to be insulated so it doesn't short out. And the myelin is what insulates it, and it helps facilitate neuronal communication. Now, the myelin is built mostly out of fat and cholesterol. You also need vitamin B12 to synthesize myelin. Remember all this, we're going to come back to it. Cholesterol and B12. Is there anything else before we move on to here? I'm trying to think. Okay, so this is a basic look at nerve impulse transmission. Like I said, a signal comes down the axon of one neuron and it's received at the dendrites of another. But they don't touch. The axons and dendrites don't actually touch. There's a very little space in between them. And that space is called a synapse. And in order for this communication to happen properly, the synapse has to be constructed properly. The neuron has to be constructed properly. These things have to have the proper shape. In biochemistry, there's a saying that structure determines function, meaning the way something is built determines what it does and how it functions. And if something is not built correctly, it's not going to function correctly. Now, one of the things that happens to neurons when the brain is not getting enough energy, remember, we said this is a fuel shortage in the brain. When these neurons do not receive enough energy, instead of having these axons and dendrites, these long, thin projections in very close proximity to each other, the neuron actually sucks them back in and they start to recede because it actually takes energy just to maintain this shape. So when they start to run out of energy, that shape starts to wither, it starts to atrophy. And now, instead of our synapse looking like this, it looks like that. Those neurons can no longer communicate with each other. That connection is lost. The natural outcome of this loss of the synapse and the loss of proper communication between neurons is the kind of memory loss and personality changes and behavioral disturbances that we see in Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is just a real quick picture as to how this looks in your brain. There are literally trillions with a T, of synapses in your brain. There's billions of neurons, but because each neuron has multiple dendrites and these axons are in contact with multiple cells, it's like this tangled mass of neurons. And when I said that those shapes actually start to wither and atrophy, they can measure that. On an MRI, your doctor can actually see that the volume of your brain has shrunk. So that's like all of this tangled mess, it would actually start to atrophy and be thinner. Now, we have a little bit more science to get through. I promise there's a method to the madness. If we really want to understand what is going wrong in the Alzheimer's brain, we have to understand the very basic anatomy and physiology of some of these cells. So remember I just said with regard to the neuron, structure determines function. If we want cells and their parts and pieces to function properly, they have to have the right shape. And those neurons, just like any other cell in your body, is surrounded by a cell membrane. I'm sure you guys have seen this kind of picture a million times. Those yellow tails that are sort of sticking up and down in that central part of the membrane are fats. Those are fatty acids. So the cell and the sort of hexagonal other smaller yellow shapes are cholesterol. Your cell membranes are predominantly made of fats and cholesterol. And if we want those cell membranes to be built correctly, we have to have the right balance of fats. We have to have enough cholesterol. One of the predominant specific fats in the brain cells, in these neurons, is DHA, the long chain omega-3 that we know typically from fatty fish and fish oil, DHA. And plenty of other fats too, but just keep in mind how important DHA is for the brain. And all of these blue things that you see, these channels, these proteins, these places where things can come into and out of the cell, they can only assume their proper shape if the membrane itself has the proper shape. I like to think of the cell membrane as the bouncer for the cell, right? If you're at a nightclub, there's a bouncer, a security guard, and he gets to decide who gets to come into the club and who has to be kicked out. And that's what the cell membrane does. And so you don't want the security guard at your club to be some frail, weak, thin person, right? You want a big, strong, burly person who's going to be able to perform that job correctly. Same thing with the cell membrane. We want the right fats, we want the right cholesterol, we want the right proteins, we want it the right shape in order to do its job. Mitochondrial dysfunction. This is a huge, huge buzzword, and I think it's overused sometimes, and I think sometimes people don't even really understand what it means. Let's break it down, because we've been saying all along that Alzheimer's disease is an energy crisis, a fuel shortage in the brain. And you probably know from some of your training that the mitochondria is the actual part of the cell where energy is generated. This is the energy factory of the cell. So if Alzheimer's is coming from a fuel problem and an energy problem, there's probably a problem with the mitochondria. So we just looked at the cell membrane, and these mitochondria have two membranes. I don't know if I don't really have a pointer. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor or not, but this mitochondria has this outer portion, this big capsule portion, and it has this inner squiggly portion. Both of those portions are surrounded by the kind of membrane we just looked at. So these things are loaded with fat, they're loaded with cholesterol, and they have to be built properly. So that's one thing. The second thing is when we talk about mitochondrial dysfunction or damaged mitochondria, mitochondrial dysfunction can really take multiple forms, but the two that we're most concerned with are glycation and oxidative stress. And we'll talk about glycation first. And if the word glycation reminds you a little bit of glucose, you're on the right track. Glycation is when substances in the body, usually proteins, but it can be just about anything, they get sticky with sugar. Like if you have chronically high blood glucose, all that glucose just gloms onto cells, it gloms onto tissue, and it just makes it all gunky. I like to compare it to if you have a child at home that's ever left a lollipop or a candy out on a hot summer day and it melts and it just gets sticky and messy. And then when it hardens, it becomes brittle like glass, and it's just a huge mess to clean up. Well, think of that happening inside your body. That's what glycation is. And if you've ever heard of hemoglobin A1C, it's kind of a longer term average measurement of your blood glucose. That's glycated hemoglobin. That's the hemoglobin protein in your blood that has become sticky with sugar. So one way that mitochondria can become damaged is through glycation. The other way is oxidation or oxidative stress. Now, oxidation is, before I forget, I should say that glycation and oxidation are both normal, necessary, healthy processes. They happen in everybody. There's no way to avoid them. The problem happens when they become uncontrolled and they happen sort of rampantly and they overwhelm the body's capacity to deal with it. So it's not that they're bad, it's that they're happening kind of out of control. So the oxidative stress, really, we're talking about damage to the fats, those critical fats in the membranes. And that happens from free radicals, which I don't want to get too far in the weeds. We have a lot more to cover, but free radicals are unpaired electron molecules. Again, totally normal. They are a normal byproduct of mitochondrial metabolism, of converting fats and carbohydrates into energy. The body naturally generates free radicals. And so you can compare oxidation, think of it like rancidity. If you've ever had a jar of nuts or a bottle of oil sit around too long and it becomes rancid and it takes on a really foul odor, that's a sign of oxidation. Those fats have become oxidized and they're no longer safe to consume. They're damaged. But oxidation doesn't just happen to the fats in our food. It can happen to the fats inside our body, the structural fats in these membranes. So there's all kinds of different things that can affect mitochondrial function. And remember, mitochondria are what produce energy. Now, if the amount of free radical species produced overwhelms the neuronal capacity to neutralize them, oxidative stress occurs, followed by mitochondrial dysfunction and neuronal damage. Mitochondrial dysfunction and the resulting energy deficit trigger the onset of neuronal degeneration and death. So in Alzheimer's disease, we know that these neurons are degenerating and they're shrinking and they're atrophying. And the question is why? And the reason is because they don't have enough energy. So now we come to one of my favorite things to talk about. Um, Alzheimer's disease is regularly referred to in the medical literature as type 3 diabetes, diabetes of the brain, or brain insulin resistance. Now, pretty much those phrases are why I wrote my book. I found it so fascinating, and nobody was talking about it. Nobody was bringing this information to the people who need it the most. This is not new. These three phrases, the type 3 diabetes, brain insulin resistance, and diabetes of the brain, go back several years, in some cases decades, in the scientific literature. This is not new. This is really the heart of what we're talking about and why I think there's a nutritional strategy to heal this illness. Now, where this phrase, so if we know nothing else about Alzheimer's disease, the minute you hear type 3 diabetes, that immediately tells you there's at least some connection to glucose and or insulin in the brain. We might not know what, but we know there's some type of connection there. And the reason they call this type 3 diabetes, and the reason it's a metabolic problem, is because the major malfunction in the Alzheimer's brain is that neurons in affected regions of the brain have lost the ability to metabolize glucose. They no longer are able to harness energy from glucose effectively. The predominant abnormality in late onset Alzheimer's disease was up to a 45% reduction in the cerebral glucose utilization. Can you imagine here? If your brain is using 45% less glucose, or it's able to generate 45% less energy, don't you think that would have a major effect on your cognitive function, on your memory, on your ability to interact, on your ability to care for yourself? You bet it would. Mm-hmm. Progress in understanding changes in brain energy metabolism during aging and Alzheimer's disease has grown rapidly in the past 3 decades, to the extent that it is now widely acknowledged that brain hypometabolism accompanies Alzheimer's. Hypometabolism meaning too little metabolism, not enough energy. In the past 3 decades, who here out there watching has been hearing about this for 30 years? Anyone? I haven't. You probably haven't either. Again, like, I cannot stress this enough. This is not new. I wrote this, I'm speaking to you because there is something we can do about this. Alzheimer's is not a complete mystery. We're not clueless about it. 30 years. If this is the first time you're hearing about it and there's someone in your family or in your life that's affected by this illness, shame on their doctor, shame on their neurologist. I'm a nutritionist. I shouldn't have had to write my book. Some neurologist should have written it 20 years ago. So this is not new. A prominent and well-characterized feature of Alzheimer's is progressive region-specific declines in the cerebral metabolic rate of glucose. Let's break this down. Let's break down the scientific gobbledygook here. And what does this say in plain English? It's progressive and region-specific declines in the cerebral metabolism of glucose. We say it's progressive because this doesn't happen overnight, right? Nobody wakes up all of a sudden one day with severe Alzheimer's disease. This is something that starts in a mild form. It's actually called mild cognitive impairment, and then it progresses over time to Alzheimer's disease. And it's region-specific, meaning, at least at first, the whole brain is not affected. It's only specific areas that are affected initially. So you might have brain fog, you might have some memory problems, but you can still dress yourself, you can still, take care of your personal hygiene, you can still drive your car. But over time, as this gets worse and worse, it does begin to affect more of the brain. But at first, it is region-specific. Now, I don't know how to stress how important what I'm about to say is, but put your thinking caps on. Reductions in cerebral glucose metabolic rate are associated with increased Alzheimer's disease risk and can be observed years before dementia onset. When we just said before that this is a progressive disease, it doesn't happen overnight. The decline in the brain's glucose usage that we're talking about is measurable in people as young as their 30s and 40s. when people are that young and they're already having a decrease in the brain's glucose metabolism, they have no signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's. And the reason is because they're young enough and they're still healthy enough that the brain is compensating. The brain is able to make up for this fuel deficit for a number of years, if not decades. You only start exhibiting memory loss and personality changes and all the signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's when the tipping point has been reached, that the brain is no longer able to compensate. But what we have to remember is that by the time those signs and symptoms are manifesting and they're visible to us and to the people around us, the disease process has been in place for years, if not decades. And I think that's part of why this is so difficult to reverse. Once someone is in a severe state, that's not a new disease. This pathology, this problem has been happening for years and years. So that's why prevention or potential prevention is so important. And I say potential prevention. I do, like to be very careful with the language. We're not 100% sure that we can prevent Alzheimer's. I think we can, but we don't know for sure. I think we can. Now, when I say type 3 diabetes, I'm not just talking about blood sugar or blood glucose, because you might be, if somebody out there watching right now has a family member or a loved one affected with Alzheimer's, you might be thinking, well, my grandma's not diabetic, or, my husband has mild cognitive impairment, but he's not diabetic. The problem with the way type 2 diabetes is diagnosed is that they only look at glucose. They never look at insulin. A type 2 diabetes diagnosis is given depending on your fasting blood glucose, your hemoglobin A1C, or your response to the oral glucose tolerance test, which is where you have to drink this super, super pure glucose liquid, and the doctor tests your blood glucose at intervals after that. Nobody ever measures insulin. And in Alzheimer's disease, you have an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease if your insulin is elevated, regardless of where your blood glucose is. Because without exaggeration, there are millions of people who have perfectly normal blood glucose and perfectly normal A1C. But those things are only normal because very, very high insulin is keeping them in check. And in Alzheimer's disease and many other chronic modern illnesses, it's actually the insulin driving the problem, even if the glucose is normal. So what are some other issues? What could tip you off that you have chronically high insulin? You could get tested. You could ask your doctor for a fasting insulin test. It's not something you can do at home. Like, we have these home glucose meters. There is no home insulin meter at the moment because everybody knows it's $1 million idea. The reason it doesn't exist yet is supposedly the biochemical test to measure insulin is not as easily put into one of those miniature devices like the glucose is. So you can ask your doctor for fasting insulin. In my opinion, it absolutely should be made a standard part of routine blood work. At a routine checkup, they should do it without question. If your fasting insulin is high, you already know there's a problem. That's a definite sign there's a metabolic problem. If your fasting level is normal, but you still have signs and symptoms of chronically high insulin, it could be that when you test first thing in the morning and it's been several hours since you've eaten, your insulin level is normal. But if you eat a meal, your insulin level is skyrocketing and it's remaining elevated for most of the day. So it is possible to have a normal fasting level, but still have it be chronically high. Now, here are some of the other signs and symptoms of chronically high insulin. Abdominal obesity. If you know somebody, it's usually men, but women too, who have kind of thin arms and legs, but it looks like they have a beach ball in their abdomen, like a big bloated belly. That's a sign of insulin resistance, of high insulin. How they used to call it a beer belly? And if any of you are familiar with a book called Wheat Belly by Dr. William Davis, he calls it a wheat belly. Some of the low carb physicians I work with call it an insulin pouch. PCOS, women with polycystic ovarian syndrome, that is absolutely driven by high insulin. Not to sound like a broken record, they actually call that diabetes of the ovaries, again, because it's an insulin problem. If you have low HDL and high triglycerides, that's a dead giveaway that you have chronically high insulin. Hypertension or high blood pressure, in most people, high blood pressure has nothing to do with how much salt you consume, how much sodium you consume. It's almost always a high insulin problem. And again, the reason nobody knows is because nobody's testing insulin. Gout, same thing, high insulin. Skin tags, a condition called acanthosis nigricans, which is a little rare, but it's kind of a graying or a blackening of some of the skin folds. So some people get it in their neck, they may get it in the inside of their elbows or the back of their knees, anywhere there's a skin fold. If that starts to become gray or ashy looking, that's a sign of high insulin. Men, erectile dysfunction. That is not a desire problem, it's not a libido problem, it's an insulin problem. It's a lack of blood flow to your male organ, and that's driven by high insulin. Same thing, men, benign prostate enlargement. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. Insulin is a growth promoter. It promotes the growth of your fat tissue, of cysts on your ovaries, of skin tags, of the prostate gland. It is a growth promoter. All of these are signs and symptoms that you might have an insulin problem, whether or not your glucose is elevated. And another chronic modern condition that we can absolutely link to chronically high insulin is Alzheimer's disease. So hyperinsulinemia is just a big fancy word for chronically high insulin. The risk for Alzheimer's disease doubled in 39% of a study sample with hyperinsulinemia, and again, was highest in people without diabetes. Why? Because diabetes is only diagnosed by glucose. They don't look at insulin. Insulin resistance may be a marker of Alzheimer's risk that is associated with reduced cerebral metabolic rate of glucose and subtle cognitive impairments at the earliest stage of disease, even before the onset of mild cognitive impairment. Again, the reduced glucose metabolism in the brain and the high insulin in the body is the first step. It's the earliest step. Memory loss is a late development in this disease. The high insulin is the canary in the coal mine. And I can tell you, regardless of your genetics, regardless of your family history, regardless of just about anything else, if you have chronically high insulin, you are at increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. Okay, the other, so I know we're covering a lot. There's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. I hope I'm not going too fast. I do tend to speak too fast. I will try to slow down. Since we're talking about the risk factors, and I've just gone on so much about insulin, there are other risk factors. If any of you are familiar at all with Alzheimer's research, you have probably come across the ApoE4 gene. They actually call this the Alzheimer's gene, but that's really misleading and it's unfair because it's not quite that simple. So we have 2 copies of every gene, right? One from our mother, one from our father. And the reason they call ApoE4 the Alzheimer's gene is because people with 1 copy are at increased risk for Alzheimer's, and people with 2 copies are at super significantly increased risk. However, you must keep in mind that plenty of people who have Alzheimer's disease do not even have 1 copy of this gene. They have other variations of this gene. And plenty of people who have not just 1 but 2 copies of this gene do not develop Alzheimer's disease. So this gene does not cause the disease. It does increase your susceptibility, but by itself, in the absence of any other contributing factors, just having this gene is not enough to cause Alzheimer's. So if you have this gene and you've been scared, keep listening. Well, let's talk about this first. The reason that the ApoE4 gene seems to cause Alzheimer's or increase risk is because the ApoE4 gene is believed to have been forged in our hunter-gatherer days, kind of more like Paleolithic times. This gene was selected against in human populations with a longer history of grain-based agriculture, meaning in populations that had a relatively higher carbohydrate intake, this gene was selected against. So what that means is that the people who do have this gene in modern times are the least suited for a high carbohydrate diet. And it's not just the high carbs, it may be other factors in the modern diet that were not a factor, 10, 15,000 years ago. So it could be a lot of the vegetable oils that are very high in omega-6 fats. It could even be problems with not enough sleep, problems with not enough physical activity. There's a lot of things feeding into it, but I would say in general, that ApoE4 gene is the worst match for the modern diet. And the people with the ApoE4 gene suffer the most. They experience the most health problems when they consume a high refined carb, high omega-6 diet. So it should be noted that E4 is not an inherently damaging allele. It is only deleterious in combination with a high carb diet, which is deleterious on its own. The ApoE epsilon 4 allele may not be inherently damaging, but only in combination with a high carb diet, which is damaging in itself and is likely to be a major contributor to the high risk of coronary artery disease and possibly Alzheimer's in the modern populations with or without the ApoE allele, the ApoE4. So again, does the ApoE4 dramatically increase your risk for Alzheimer's? Yes, but it doesn't cause Alzheimer's. It increases your risk because you're eating and living in such a way as to bring about the mismatch, the evolutionary mismatch that this gene is. So again, if you're familiar with Alzheimer's disease or Alzheimer's research, you have no doubt heard the term amyloid plaque or amyloid protein. Remember earlier, we talked about the neurons and these synapses and how everything has to have the right shape in order for these cells to communicate with each other. So amyloid proteins can build up outside the cells and kind of get in the way. They just kind of build up and create all this debris, all this detritus in between the cells. And so, okay, it makes sense then. It makes sense that this might be contributing to Alzheimer's disease if it's interfering with neuronal communication. But one thing to keep in mind is that not everybody who has Alzheimer's disease has significant deposition of these plaques in their brain. And then there's other people who die from other causes who had no signs or symptoms of Alzheimer's, who when they have their brains autopsied, they do have significant plaque deposition. So either these plaques are not the main cause of Alzheimer's, or they're not, either they're not a cause at all, or they're not the main cause. And these amyloid plaques come from amyloid proteins, and our neurons secrete these proteins just like glycation, just like oxidation. This is a normal process. This happens in everybody. It's supposed to happen. The problem in Alzheimer's disease is that these proteins are not cleared away properly. It's like the sanitation crew is on strike. And so I liken this to a fever. Without boring you with too many details, the amyloid proteins are actually protective. They're secreted in response to neuronal injury. So when we have a biochemical injury, so to speak, this energy shortage creating a biochemical injury in these cells, these amyloid proteins are secreted as a protective measure. But I like to compare this to a fever situation. When your body has a fever, that's a protective step in your body. It's your body's way of raising your core temperature in order to fight off whatever pathogen is in you making you sick. And so that's great, except if the fever goes too high, the fever itself becomes a problem. And it's the same thing with these amyloid proteins. When these proteins are secreted and then cleared away properly, there's no problem. The problem only comes when they're not cleared away properly and they start to build up. And when these proteins build up, they kind of cross-link with each other, joining together into these solid plaques. And these plaques are what get in the way of the cells. Now, something that connects this whole process back to a problem with chronically high insulin is that the cleanup crew, the sanitation crew that's responsible for clearing away these amyloid proteins, believe it or not, is something called insulin degrading enzyme. Now, you guys are nutrition students, so you know that most enzymes in the body have different substrates, right? They have more than one target that they can work on. Some enzymes only have one, but insulin degrading enzyme has multiple targets, one of which is insulin, one of which is these amyloid proteins, and there's a few other ones. Now, parents that have more than one child will always claim that they don't have a favorite child, right? Even if they do, they'll claim that they don't have favorites. Enzymes are not like that. Enzymes in the body always do pick favorites. They have what we call a higher affinity for a certain substrate or a certain target than for another. The favorite child, if you will, of insulin degrading enzyme is insulin. So when your insulin level is chronically elevated, that insulin degrading enzyme is always going to be too busy dealing with all the insulin to go after these amyloid proteins, thus leaving these amyloid proteins to accumulate and build up. So this all keeps coming back to insulin. And then before I forget, something that has always fascinated me about this amyloid, and thank goodness, you'll see more and more research trickling out now that the amyloid, what they call the amyloid hypothesis, is dead or at least crumbling. It's starting to die. They're starting to recognize more and more that this amyloid just simply isn't the cause of Alzheimer's disease. Every single pharmaceutical drug that has been developed to go after these amyloid proteins has been a failure. Now, you would think if these amyloid plaques are causing Alzheimer's disease or making it worse, if we had a drug that could reduce the formation or prevent the formation of these plaques, well, bam, that's a slam dunk. We've just cured Alzheimer's. Or if not cured it, we've made a huge dent in treating it. And yet, every single drug that has done that has failed to have any favorable impact on this disease. These drugs do succeed in reducing the formation of the amyloid, but the reduction in the amyloid does nothing to stop this disease from getting worse. And it's just like statin drugs. I don't know how familiar you are with the cholesterol hypothesis and the madness surrounding that. So you're either going to be right on the page with me here or I'm about to blow your mind, but it's very similar to how statin drugs work. Statin drugs do lower cholesterol, but having lower cholesterol does not guarantee you freedom from heart disease or heart attack. And it's the same with Alzheimer's disease. Having less amyloid, having fewer amyloid plaques doesn't protect you from continued memory loss and continued cognitive decline. And I think, Richard said at the intro of this presentation that Alzheimer's disease has overtaken cancer as the most feared illness of our time. And I think this is part of why, because every drug has been a failure. There's a couple of Alzheimer's drugs on the market now that do very, very little to stop this disease. They have very little impact upon the progression. And I think that's the fear, because even with cancer, even though the mortality rate is still so high, there are treatments. There's chemo, there's radiation, there's drugs, there's dietary therapies. There are viable interventions that have been shown to work at least somewhat. With Alzheimer's, we don't even have that. It's really, truly, as far as we know, a death sentence. There's no standard of care for Alzheimer's. The standard of care is get your affairs in order and prepare for your decline. It's really unfortunate that there's nothing the conventional medical world has to offer. I think that's a failure of imagination. It's a failure of medical education, because I think there is something to offer, and we're going to get to that very soon. One more thing before I move on about these drugs that have been developed to target these amyloid proteins. There was one drug a few years ago that was being tested to target the plaques, And the phase 3 clinical trials had to be stopped early because the people on the drug were faring so much worse than the people on the placebo that they had to stop it. It would have been unethical to continue. So clearly, these plaques are either they're not the cause, and they may even be helpful, which is why when we have a drug that stops them or reduces them, people actually get worse. So this is just kind of a very basic representation of the plaques we've been talking about and how they just sort of gunk up and hang on to these neurons and interfere with their proper communication. Okay, a little bit more about the amyloid. Low regional cerebral metabolic rate of glucose, the energy shortage, the decline in glucose usage in the brain appears to be a very early event in the disease process, well before any clinical signs of dementia are evident, and well before cell loss or plaque deposition is predicted to have occurred. So even these amyloid proteins are a late player, just like the signs and symptoms. It's a late development. The first domino to fall in this process is the glucose metabolism that, remember I said, is detectable in people in their 30s and 40s. One real quick thing, we've been saying all along that this is a problem related to glucose metabolism in the brain. One reason why we might think that these amyloid proteins are a cause or a major contributing factor to Alzheimer's is that they actually interfere with glucose metabolism. They reduce the brain's glucose metabolism, but being that they're a late player, the glucose metabolism is already reduced for some reason. And remember, we talked earlier about glycation. And you being nutrition students or grads, I forget that I'm talking to a lot of people, sorry. You being nutrition professionals, understand how dangerous and how damaging chronically high blood sugar is. There's no body system, tissue system, organ system that is not detrimentally affected by chronically high blood sugar. So it's almost as if by secreting these amyloid proteins, which remember are protective, they're secreted in response to neuronal injury, by secreting these proteins that reduce glucose usage, the brain is almost saying, oh, I'm so damaged from all this glucose. I already have so much glycation. Please stop giving me so much glucose. And since you're going to keep drinking your orange juice and eating your bagels and eating your biscuits and your crisps, I'm going to force you to stop using glucose. I'm just going to shut it off. I'm going to shut off the glucose spigot in the brain by secreting these proteins. So if I can anthropomorphize the neurons, I'm putting words in their mouth. We don't want glucose, stop giving it to us. But since you won't, we're gonna shut it off ourselves by secreting these amyloid proteins. So I promise we are going to get to the dietary intervention very soon, but we have to talk about some obstacles to healthy cognitive function. Remember I said earlier when we looked at the structure of the neuron and the structure of the cell membrane, that these require certain fats, they require cholesterol, they require certain nutrients, right? Human physiology doesn't happen by magic. These biochemical processes don't exist in a vacuum. They need nutrients. There's a reason we need zinc. There's a reason we need vitamin B12 and magnesium and choline. All of these things are not required for no reason. And if there's one nice thing we can say about Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's is pretty miserable, right? If there's one generous thing we can say about it, it's that it's an equal opportunity killer. It strikes people of all ethnicities, all races, all faiths, all economic classes. Nobody is immune. So Alzheimer's doesn't discriminate, except that it seems to strike older people. So we're going to talk about some of the obstacles that are typically in older people, but also not so older people, because, they used to joke and call Alzheimer's disease old-timers disease, except we are no longer talking about exclusively elderly people, right? We might think it's natural and to be expected that someone in their 80s or 90s is going to decline a little bit, right? It's not reasonable to expect someone who's 95 to have the same degree of mental sharpness that they had when they were 25. So that's okay. But when this starts happening to people in their 50s and their 60s, then we've got a problem. And that's exactly what we see now, don't we? This is not a disease that's exclusively limited to very elderly people. So right now we're going to look at some of the drugs and some of the issues that are very, very common in middle-aged people and in our elders that are having a direct impact on healthy cognitive function. So there are some drugs called PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, and they are prescription antacids. And there's other types of prescription antacids. And these drugs are much, what is the word? I don't want to use the word worse, but they're much worse than we think they are. These drugs don't just reduce your stomach acid. Your stomach is supposed to be very acidic, right? Hydrochloric acid is an extremely strong acid. And it's because that strong acidity is required to liberate the nutrients from your food, right? It does no good to eat, really good quality nutrient dense foods if you're not digesting them properly, if you're not absorbing those nutrients. And what we do when we take prescription and over-the-counter antacids, people pop them like they're candy. In the US they do. I don't know if they do in Ireland. They pop them like they're candy here. And when these drugs were never intended to be long-term drugs. Nobody was ever supposed to be taking these for 10, 15, 20 years. Now, if healthy cognitive function or healthy bodily function of any kind requires certain nutrients, don't we think there's going to be a major problem if we're taking a drug that is designed to limit the proper digestion of food and the proper absorption of nutrients? B12 is I keep saying it because it's the one that comes to mind the most for healthy cognitive function. B12 deficiency is actually sometimes mistakenly diagnosed as cognitive impairment, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, any type of neurological or neurodegenerative disease. B12 is a major factor there. These long-term use of these prescription antacids come with so many side effects that they don't tell you about. And unfortunately, it's not like having a food allergy where you eat peanuts and you break out in hives or you pass out. These problems take 10, 15 years to develop. But if you haven't been absorbing calcium and magnesium and phosphorus for 20 years, don't you think you have osteoporosis? Don't you think you'll have anemia? Don't you think you'll have iron deficiency anemia if you haven't been absorbing iron for 20 years? Yes, and that's exactly what we see with long-term side effects of these drugs, and we see an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. I've been talking about cholesterol a little bit because cholesterol is a huge player in healthy cognition. You cannot have healthy brain function without adequate cholesterol, period. Cholesterol, I think without exaggeration, is the single most misunderstood, maligned, and wrongfully accused substance in all of medical history. We've gotten the cholesterol story so wrong, it's insane. Remember, I showed you the picture of the cell membrane, it's all cholesterol. The neurons, it's all cholesterol. So it's been known for a long time now that statins interfere with healthy cognitive function because the brain needs so much cholesterol. Remember we said the brain is only about 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20 to 25% of all the glucose and oxygen in your body. It also contains about 20% of all the cholesterol in your body. So this is taken directly from the United States Food and Drug Administration's website. That's our agency that is supposedly in charge of the safety of the drugs that are available in the US. Information about the potential for generally non-serious and reversible cognitive side effects, memory loss and confusion, and reports of increased blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C have been added to the statin labels. The FDA continues to believe that the cardiovascular benefits of statins outweigh these small increased risks. The cardiovascular benefits of statins outweigh these small increased risks. Do you all know what that means in plain English? Congratulations, Mr. Smith. You've got the lowest cholesterol in the dementia ward. I mean, like, I'm making a joke, but this is really serious. Like, this is terrible. You cannot have healthy cognitive function without enough cholesterol. And the increased risk for diabetes, that's a whole other topic. You know, maybe I could come back sometime, but yes, statin drugs actually do increase the risk for type 2 diabetes. So again, more information directly from the United States FDA's website on statins. Memory loss and confusion have been reported with statin use. These reported events were generally not serious, and they went away once the drug was no longer being taken. This is what they tell the healthcare providers on the website. There have been rare, but really not so rare, post-marketing reports of cognitive impairment, memory loss, forgetfulness, amnesia, memory impairment, confusion associated with statin use. These reported symptoms are generally not serious and reversible upon statin discontinuation. Well, that's great, but how often do doctors tell their patients to stop taking their statin? It's all well and good if your memory loss and your confusion goes away when you stop taking your statin, except when your doctor threatens you to never, ever stop taking your statin. I mean, I'm not anti-medication. There are, you know, cases in which statins may be helpful. I'm not trying to malign them completely, but we have to have an appreciation for their long-term biochemical side effects. You know, you cannot look at the mechanism by which statins work and not think that they're going to negatively impact cognitive function. They have shown over and over and over again that higher cholesterol is actually protective as we age, in men and women, but especially in women. When I get a client, I mean, I see private nutrition clients, and when I get a client who comes to me whose cholesterol is very, very low, I don't pat them on the back and say, congratulations. I say to myself, oh my goodness, what's wrong here? You know, cholesterol that's very, very, very high might be a problem, but cholesterol that is too low is actually much more worrisome to me than cholesterol that is quote unquote high, whatever you want to think that might be. So again, quotes from some of the researchers, high LDL, you know, the bad cholesterol, even though I hope you know that's a misnomer, high LDL is inversely associated with mortality in most people over 60 years. Our analysis provides reason to question the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis. Now, I'm sure you all know inversely associated means the higher the cholesterol, the lower the risk for mortality. Now, to be clear, everybody's risk for mortality is 100%, right? So far as we know. I hate that when they say, oh, risk for mortality is decreased. No, everybody's risk for mortality is still 100%. But when they say reduce risk for all-cause mortality, they just generally mean that your risk of dying from anything except a nice, healthy old age is lower. Non-demented elderly with levels of total cholesterol, non-HDL, and LDL in the lowest quartile were approximately twice as likely to die as those in the highest quartile. Again, higher cholesterol, longer life. Higher cholesterol in late life was associated with decreased dementia risk. These findings, so they did a study in very elderly Chinese people. These findings suggest that cholesterol levels within the high normal range are associated with better cognitive performance in Chinese elderly, specifically in the oldest old. With further validation, low cholesterol may serve as a clinical indicator of risk for cognitive impairment in the elderly. If your cholesterol is going down, your cognitive function is probably also going down. I just can't stress this enough. And again, each situation is individual. These may not be entirely blanket statements, but it kind of breaks my heart when I see an elderly person on a statin. Why? Especially if they have compromised cognitive function. Are we more concerned about a cardiovascular event that may or may not happen and probably won't happen, or are we concerned that their brain is literally starving to death? I mean, where are the priorities in an elderly person? Okay, this is what you came for. This is why we're all watching. if Alzheimer's disease is a metabolic problem, and if it's an energy shortage in the brain, what are we going to do about it? If I didn't think there was something we could do about it, if I wasn't convinced that we could have an impact on this disease, I wouldn't have written the book. I wouldn't be speaking to you right now. So what are we going to do? Alzheimer's disease may be similar to obesity, coronary artery disease, and type 2 diabetes in being a consequence of the conflict between our Paleolithic genetic constitution and our current Neolithic diet. Remember, I said at the beginning, we sort of take for granted that diet and lifestyle play a role in so many other chronic conditions. And when it comes to Alzheimer's, we just completely dismiss that that's even possible, that this could be every bit a diet and lifestyle disease, just like all the others are. Now, if the primary problem is that the brain has lost the ability to properly metabolize glucose and it doesn't have enough fuel, wouldn't it be great if there was some sort of alternative fuel that the brain could use? Wouldn't it be great if we could nourish these starving cells with some other type of energy source? Indeed, we can. The brain is like a hybrid car. It can run on a lot of different types of fuels. So one of the fuels it runs on, obviously, is glucose. But the other fuel that the brain not only runs on, but truly thrives on is ketones. And some of you may be brand new to this. Some of you are probably very familiar, but I'll just try to make it entertaining for everybody. Ketones are a normal metabolic fuel. They tend to only be produced when our insulin levels are very low and when we're burning a lot of fat. Ketones are a byproduct of fat metabolism. And when your glucose is chronically high and your insulin is chronically high, your body is running primarily on carbohydrate. When you dramatically cut back on your carbohydrate intake, there's not enough to fuel your body. So your body is forced to transition to running on a different type of fuel. And the fuel most of your body will run on is fat. That's why low-carb diets are so good for losing weight and for losing body fat. As a byproduct of metabolizing all that fat, whether it's your own stored body fat or fat in your food, a byproduct of metabolizing all that fat are these ketones. And the ketones themselves can serve as an energy substrate. And there's some other ways to produce ketones. We'll look at that in a minute. But so the interesting thing is that this fuel shortage in the brain, this impairment in the ability to use glucose, would not be a problem at all if ketones were available, right? If the brain had access to another type of fuel and it couldn't use glucose, okay, no problem. But when people's insulin levels are chronically high, as they are in most of us, or in most people that are eating a very high carb diet, who are sedentary, who are not sleeping enough, all the other factors that affect insulin staying high, we don't have ketones. Ketones are only produced under very specific circumstances. So without access to ketones, these neurons do continue to wither and atrophy and decline. So throughout much of evolution, ketosis likely served as a valuable survival mechanism to fuel brain metabolism during times of food scarcity. Hence, I love this line. This is one of my favorite lines ever from a paper. In some ways, the modern diet can be considered keto deficient. How's that? Now,
Right.
If you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember this. And it's in red because, red means important, right? 2 points are clear. Alzheimer's disease is at least in part exacerbated by, if not actually caused by, chronic progressive brain fuel starvation due specifically to brain glucose deficit, not ketone deficit, brain glucose deficit, and attempting to treat the cognitive deficit early in Alzheimer's using ketogenic interventions is safe, ethical, and scientifically well-founded. Now, in case anyone watching tonight has a relative or is themselves a type 1 diabetic, the type of ketosis we're talking about here is very different from the ketoacidosis that you may be familiar with. That's very dangerous, that's could be fatal actually, when someone's ketone levels rise very, very, very high. And it usually happens in type 1 diabetics if they don't have the proper insulin. It happens rarely in a type 2 who doesn't have the proper medication. The type of ketosis we're talking about is just orders of magnitude different. It's very, very different. This is just the safe, benign, nutritionally induced ketosis that's completely controlled in a healthy body on a low-carb diet. So other ways that you can raise ketones, I mean, the primary, easiest, most basic way to do this is with a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet. And we'll talk about some of the details in a bit, but fasting will also do it. Anytime your insulin level is going to get low enough, you will generate some ketones. Exercise can do it. Even if you're consuming a high carb diet, exercise can still generate a little bit of ketones. Coconut oil and MCT oil will help you generate ketones even if you're eating a lot of carbohydrate. So coconut oil is rich in MCTs, medium chain triglycerides, and those are a special kind of fat that don't follow the same digestive and breakdown process as other types of fat. They are more readily converted directly into ketones. So for example, one researcher named Mary Newport is a physician whose husband had Alzheimer's disease, and she started doing some research into the potential for MCTs and coconut oil for cognitive function. And her husband was, on a traditional American type junk diet. She did nothing but add coconut oil to his oatmeal. She changed nothing else to his diet. He was still eating his high carb diet and he was just taking coconut oil. And just that was enough for her to observe an improvement in him. Not a huge improvement, but enough of an improvement to spur her on to further research into this, to change other factors. But just the coconut oil alone will elevate ketones. And of course, there's exogenous ketones. Depending on how familiar you are with some of this research, whether it's for Alzheimer's or other applications of a low carb or ketogenic diet, you may have heard of exogenous ketones, and I'll just touch on them briefly here. Exogenous means from the outside, right? So they now have on the market available what's basically a ketone supplement. It usually comes as a powder that you can mix into a beverage and you drink it. And these things can be absolutely wonderful for people with Alzheimer's disease, because if the primary problem is that we don't have enough brain fuel, and these ketones will fuel the brain, because the thing about Alzheimer's is even though these cells have lost the ability to take up and use glucose, they do take up and use ketones. They've shown this in study after study. When you get the people's ketone levels elevated, they do have improved cognition. So we know this works. It's not a slam dunk. It's not like Alzheimer's is reversed immediately. It's not quite that magical, but they do have some improvement in cognition. The problem with the exogenous ketones is that they have a very short half-life. Once they're metabolized, they're gone. So compare that to a ketogenic diet where somebody is producing endogenous ketones, meaning they're generating their own ketones inside their body 24/7, even at a low level. So I think the real, the 1-2 punch comes from a ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones, because the diet also has many, many beneficial effects on several aspects of physiology that the exogenous ketones by themselves do not. The exogenous ketones will provide fuel for the brain, but unlike the diet, they do not chronically, improve your insulin levels, improve your glucose levels, reduce oxidative stress, reduce mitochondrial dysfunction. The ketogenic diet is anti-inflammatory. It has all these other effects that the ketones by themselves don't. But for someone with severe dementia, who's in a very severe state or is very elderly, let's be realistic. You're not going to get that person to give up their morning, muffin and juice with grape jam in favor of eggs cooked in butter or coconut oil. So for people that are unable or unwilling to change their diet or lifestyle, yes, absolutely give them the ketones. But if there's somebody who's able to change their diet and has enough, presence of mind and cognitive control to do that diet, then do that. So one question that I get asked very often is, do I need to be on a ketogenic diet to prevent this or to potentially prevent it? And my educated speculation is no. The type of diet the type of intervention that's required to reverse a disease that's already happened is not necessarily the same one that you need to prevent that disease from happening in the first place. And I compare it to having an insect infestation in your home. If you have an insect infestation, you call a professional exterminator, they come to your house and they spray and they set off these toxic bug bombs, and that gets rid of the infestation. But that doesn't mean that you needed to have all that toxic stuff in your home in order to prevent the infestation from happening in the first place. You could have, kept the doors and windows sealed, don't leave unsealed food sitting out. There's lower level, sort of safer steps to take that can prevent a problem from happening. And once the problem has already happened, you need a more drastic intervention. And I think that's exactly what we have here in Alzheimer's disease. The primary event leading to the development of Alzheimer's disease is consumption of an evolutionarily discordant diet. This hypothesis predicts that relatively simple preventive measures, such as lowering the consumption of starchy carbs and increasing essential fats in the diet, will be effective. Again, simple dietary modification towards fewer highly processed carbs and relatively more fats and cholesterol is likely a protective measure against Alzheimer's disease. So do you absolutely have to be on a super, super low carb diet all the time? Probably not. Now, what does a potentially preventive diet look like? It's a nutrient dense, lower carb diet. And I say lower because all of us vary in our carbohydrate tolerance, right? Some of us can consume 150, 200, 300 grams of carbohydrate a day and remain metabolically healthy, remain lean, remain fit, remain well, and that's great. Many of us can't. Many of us have to stay under 150 grams of carbs. Many of us have to stay under 100, under 50. You have to sort of identify where your safe spot is, where your individual level of tolerance lies. So I don't think that we all have to be ketogenic all the time. What we do have to do is eat and live in such a way that we keep our blood glucose and insulin levels within a healthy range. And all of us will just differ in the amount of carbohydrate that we can consume and accomplish that. Some of us will be able to have more than others. So a nutrient-dense, lower carb, lower insulin diet, I mean, this does not look like diet food. This is not a hardship diet to follow. It's not like, oh, I have to give up all this stuff. Maybe you do have to either eliminate or go much lower on bread and pasta and things you might really enjoy. But, the flip side is that you get to eat delicious fatty meats and all these gorgeous dairy products and a wide variety of non-starchy vegetables. And in Ireland, God, you guys are so lucky. Your food quality is so much better than what's in the States. I mean, most of your animals are still out on pasture. They're still eating that gorgeous green grass that you have there. And your dairy products are, all those cows are still eating grass. And some of that dairy is probably raw and unpasteurized, which is fabulous. This is what that kind of diet looks like. It's not a punishment, and is there room for the occasional bit of ice cream, the occasional bit of cheesecake? Yes. This isn't an all or nothing thing. It's you have to find your own level of metabolic safety, for lack of a better word. So there is hope. I think that there's so much we can do about this, and there's so many more articles coming out now about the connection between insulin and between glucose in the brain. There's even been a few where they've pointed out that elevated blood glucose, even within the normal range, but the high end of the normal range, increases risk for Alzheimer's disease. So this is trickling down, but it's trickling down very slowly. And I want to leave you with that message of hope. I think that we are not clueless about this. Like I said at the beginning, we still have a lot of unanswered questions. I don't pretend that this is a magical cure for Alzheimer's. It is not. It is a nutritional intervention that based on the biochemical problems at work in the Alzheimer's brain, it's an intervention that stands a very substantial chance of helping people with this condition. Now, the question would be, is it reversible? If someone's in a very, very severe state, can you actually turn this around? And I think it's never too late. No one should ever be considered a lost cause. But of course, the younger someone is, the healthier they are, the more likely they are to experience a benefit from anything, be it a dietary intervention or a drug or any other type of strategy to help this. The more severe and advanced the disease, the more difficult it's going to be to turn it around. But we know that when I say that these cells are sort of atrophying and shrinking, they're not dead. Some people will say, well, Alzheimer's is the death of neurons. You know, I've said that before in the past, just speaking too quickly. These cells are not dead. They're more like hibernating. They're like your computer going into power save mode, right? It's like conserving energy. When these cells start to be starved for fuel, in order to conserve energy to keep that cell body alive, remember I said it shrinks those axons and dendrites, recedes them back in like a vacuum with a retractable cord, sucking it in. That cell is still alive. And we know those cells are still alive because when they do these studies where they elevate people's ketone levels, whether it's through exogenous ketones, a ketogenic diet, or MCT oil, all three of those have been shown to work. When these patients and subjects, ketone levels are elevated, they have better cognition. If those neurons were dead, they would not have any improvement, right? Because if that cell's dead, it's dead. It can't metabolize anything. But it's almost like it's hibernating. It's in low power mode. And once it receives ketones, once it starts being fed again and nourished with the fuel it can use, it comes back to life. And again, I do think the older someone is, the more advanced the disease, the less likely it is you're going to see a noticeable improvement. But I don't think anyone should ever be considered a lost cause. And of course, in those cases, the exogenous ketones are probably going to be much more helpful than the ketogenic diet. And someone with a very severe disease probably wouldn't be able to adhere to the ketogenic diet anyway, unfortunately. We are coming up on the end, so we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. But this is my book. It's called The Alzheimer's Antidote, and it's available on Amazon. I think you can get it in Ireland on Amazon. And my email address is there. You're welcome to contact me. You know, I'm happy to do the Q&A here, but if you have anything that you just want to ask privately, feel free to send me an email. So I think we're about done. And just if anyone ever wants to ask about anything else, obviously I work with Alzheimer's, but I do, I specialize in low carbohydrate diets, mainly for metabolic issues. So type 2 diabetes, obesity, PCOS, you know, gout, hypertension. I also am, you know, willing to help people with other neurological and neurodegenerative conditions, whether it's Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis, because it would be the same diet. The same type of low carb, high fat, nutrient dense diet for Alzheimer's would, I think, potentially be effective for the rest. So thank you. I appreciate your time. I hope I didn't put anyone to sleep out there. I really appreciate you spending your evening with me.
Mm-hmm. No.
Do I have to look at the questions here?
Yes, please, Amy. There's you'll see two boxes, one with Q&A and one with chat. And if you can move from one to the other, please, because different people use different boxes, and then you can answer them as you see from top.
Okay, so I see one. Anne has asked, what is an okay figure for cholesterol in women over 50? It's really hard to give a number. I don't know that there's any threshold amount that's considered healthy. I can tell you that when it's, so I'm going to speak in the US units. Unfortunately, I don't know the translation of what units you might use there, but for the units that we use in the US, anytime your total cholesterol is over 200 milligrams, I think, per deciliter, they want to put you on a statin. And for me personally, my own cholesterol is far above 200, and I don't care. My doctor's never even mentioned it. She doesn't care. So I think above 200 is fine. I would start getting concerned if I saw it like 140, 150, I'd be concerned, but not overly worried. I do think that too low is more harmful than too high. I can say that. And in terms of cardiovascular risk, your total cholesterol and your LDL say almost nothing about the degree of plaque built up in your arteries, and they say nothing about your risk for heart disease or heart attack. The most important indicators of your cardiovascular status are your insulin, your HDL, and your triglycerides. If your HDL is low and your triglycerides are high, that is a sign of chronically elevated insulin, and that is really bad news for the blood vessels and the heart. That the high cholesterol has almost nothing to do with heart disease. So I'm sorry, that's not really giving you an exact answer, but so then there's a couple here. Is there? Oh, there's chat. Let's see what this says. Oh, there's a lot. Let's see. Can this mechanism also explain patients who complain of brain fog? Yes, you bet. One of the most commonly reported quote unquote side effects, although it's a beneficial side effect of a low carb diet, is banishing of brain fog. It's almost like somebody turned the lights on, somebody cleared the cobwebs out. So yes, I think chronically high ups and downs in blood sugar and insulin can interfere with brain function for sure, with like brain fog, yes. Heavy metals, what role, if any, do heavy metals, particularly aluminum and mercury, play in Alzheimer's? Good question. To be honest, I have not looked into it that much. I think the aluminum link is probably vastly overplayed. I think mercury can have an effect. I mean, mercury is known to sort of interfere with cognition. I wish I could comment more. I don't know enough about it to really comment. I do think, I think the metabolic problem comes first, although there's a doctor named Dale Bredesen, Bredesen. He's written a book called The End of Alzheimer's, and he talks about some of the other issues that may be causing cognitive impairment in people. So to me, Alzheimer's disease is defined by the metabolic state. It's by the glucose and insulin problems in the brain. There's other forms of cognitive decline and cognitive impairment that may be caused by heavy metal toxicity or even like an infection, a bacterial type problem. To me, those are other forms of cognitive impairment, but I wouldn't call them Alzheimer's disease. But Dr. Bredesen addresses those in his book. Is it possible to do a ketogenic diet as a vegetarian or vegan? It is. I don't recommend doing it as a vegan simply because I just think you're not going to get the nutrients that you need. As a vegetarian, like if you're consuming eggs or dairy products, you should be fine. Eggs, especially if you're getting high quality, if you know that those animals were raised on pasture and raised properly, you can get adequate B12 and zinc and choline. On the vegan diet, not really. That being said, I may not, personally be in favor of that choice, but if someone absolutely insists on avoiding all animal products, you can still get a benefit of a vegan diet by doing a high-fat, low-carb vegan diet, because there's vegans who live on fruit and bread and grain, right? And dates and sugar and figs. You can do a vegan diet and eat a lot more coconut products, fat, avocado, olives, nuts, and seeds. I still think you're going to struggle to get enough protein. You're going to struggle to get enough iron, enough B12, enough DHA. All of these nutrients that we've said are so critical for cognitive function. So I think it can be done. I don't recommend it. I think lacto-ovo is a better way to go if somebody's willing to at least introduce those products. How can you find out your carbohydrate threshold? Well, if you have a home glucose meter, if those are available in Ireland, you can use those. You don't have to test every day all the time, but test before and after meals for 2 weeks or so just to see where you are. If you don't want to do that, you can just go to the doctor and see how your hemoglobin A1C is, see what your fasting glucose is. Again, the triglycerides and HDL will also be a sign as to whether or not you are staying within your own carbohydrate threshold. It's hard. It's hard. I mean, I would probably recommend using the home meter, but I also don't like for people get very obsessed with the numbers and the data and the tracking, and they let the numbers really scare them. And so it's kind of a fine balance with that. Where else is chat? Is there an Italian translation of my book? Not yet, but let's recommend that. There is a Spanish version, and I think there's a Polish version. I don't know if there's an Italian version yet. What are the most practical ways to keep track of your level of ketosis? Well, so there are ketone meters. Well, there's 3 different ways to measure your ketones. You can measure it in your urine with the urine test strip. You can measure it in your blood, or you can measure it in your breath. Frankly, for most people, I actually don't recommend testing. Most people do not need to test their ketones unless you are using this type of diet specifically for a medical condition where you must have elevated ketones. Like a lot of people who are using a low carb diet mainly for fat loss or general well-being do not need to measure their ketones. They don't even need to have high ketones at all. You can have, if you are eating, relatively low carbohydrate, you can have a fat-based metabolism. You can be off that blood sugar roller coaster. You can primarily be running on fat, even if you're not producing very elevated ketones. So sometimes people will be doing a very good diet, getting good sleep, exercising, and they don't ever really see high ketones, and they think they're doing something wrong. And they're not. Some people's bodies just generate ketones more easily than others. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong. Where I would recommend starting to measure is if you have a specific goal that you're trying to accomplish, whether it's losing body fat or having sharper thinking or improving some type of marker in your blood, and you're not getting that result, then you might want to test, because maybe you're not actually in ketosis. And not everybody does need to be in ketosis to achieve those goals, but some people do. So those are the practical ways to keep track. You can test. I just caution people, if you're going to test, try not to get completely obsessed and neurotic with the numbers. And I have a blog post, maybe we can link to it, or if somebody wants to read it, they can email me. I guess I can type it in the message, can't I? I'll put the link if I can, because it's okay to measure your ketones, but you have to understand how to interpret the data that you see. You can't just see the number and come to all kinds of crazy conclusions that are maybe not true. What do I think about fasting for a few days? Excellent question. So there's a whole chapter on fasting in my book, because fasting is one way to elevate ketones. Obviously, I mean, a low carb diet will bring insulin levels down and produce ketones, but what's going to be even more effective than that is fasting. So fasting can be very therapeutic, very effective, but it's not appropriate for everybody. Especially if we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, some of these elderly people are already underweight. If they're already underweight, I do not, support fasting. I see a lot of young, athletic, very overstressed out women who want to fast because they think they have to fast, or they should fast, or there's some magical benefit to fasting, and they really get into trouble. So fasting is not appropriate for everybody. I think if you want to do a multi-day fast, make sure that you know what you're doing with proper electrolyte supplementation. If you are on medication, especially if somebody is a diabetic and taking insulin or blood pressure medication, you must work with a physician. Or even not just with fasting, even with a low carb or ketogenic diet. If you make a very dramatic change to your carbohydrate intake, those medications sometimes need to be adjusted on the first day. So it's not something to do by yourself if you're taking medication. But yes, fasting in general can be helpful for cognitive function and for producing ketones. What else do we have? Brain surgery. Oh my gosh. Well, so Cheryl has asked about a relative with some brain surgery, and he can't eat. He's got a lot of problems. I'm not a physician. I really can't comment except to say that if he's getting, total parenteral nutrition, they may be putting glucose in that. You might be able to request a ketogenic formulation. They do exist, where instead of like a glucose and dextrose solution, they can give you ketones or MCT oil or something. You would have to check with the doctors in charge. I don't imagine they're going to be that familiar with it, but it couldn't hurt to ask. Anyone with any kind of, if he's going to have like neurological or cognitive effects from this, I just think anything you can do to reduce glucose and insulin are probably going to help and get the ketones elevated. Thank you for the compliments. Yeah, so here you've mentioned the ketonics breath meter. If one of your parents has had Alzheimer's, does it make sense to apply this diet preventively at age 35? Yes. That's the slide where I had, the potential prevention. But again, I don't think you need to follow a very, very strict ketogenic diet. I think you have to eat what is for you a diet that keeps your insulin and glucose levels in a healthy range. And again, that's not something that you have to test every day, but get a baseline, go get a checkup, get your A1C tested. You must request fasting insulin because it's really important, but they won't do it unless you request it. So the insulin, get a full metabolic panel, so see where you are. But yes, I think that eating a controlled carbohydrate diet stands a good chance of preventing this. Now, I mean, as long as we're talking about prevention too, I guess if they can still see you guys can still see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Because there's two things we'll talk about real quick with regard to prevention and potentially reversing this in an early mild stage. It's not just about the diet. I do think the diet is the biggest, most important part, but sleep is a huge factor in healthy metabolism. Short sleep or interrupted sleep, broken sleep is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and Alzheimer's disease. I think a lot of us don't realize how important sleep is actually for glucose and insulin regulation. When you don't sleep enough, so many of the hormones are just not where they're supposed to be. And a lot of that affects the way your body processes carbohydrate. And so in general, as a general rule, sleep is very, very important. So you don't want to be chronically sleep deprived for 10, 20, 30 years and think you're going to just magically have good cognitive function, in spite of that. And then the other interesting thing with sleep is remember that we talked about those amyloid proteins and plaques and how they are a protective thing. They're totally fine, except when they build up and they're not cleared away properly. And we said that insulin degrading enzyme helps clear them away, which is why when you have chronically high insulin, these proteins are sort of left behind to build up. Well, they have determined that these proteins are more effectively cleared away while we sleep. They're cleared away when we're awake too, but it happens much better, much more efficiently when we're asleep. And I think part of that may just be the body's natural circadian rhythm. There may be natural biochemical cues that happen when we sleep, but part of it also is that when you sleep, your insulin levels are going to be probably lower than they are at any other point in the day, because let's say it's been, 7-8 hours since you last ate anything. So I think sleep is a big factor in terms of prevention and exercise. Again, like I said, with type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, all these modern sort of chronic conditions where we just take it as a given that diet and exercise and sleep and stress reduction and all of that plays a role in keeping you healthy, mentally and physically and cognitively. It's a cliche because it's true, diet and exercise. And so this little picture here is just like, think of exercise as fertilizer for your neurons. It helps them grow, it helps feed them. And there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, one of the big ones is that exercise, and not just exercise, I don't just mean, you know, running or biking, any type of activity, going for a walk, just remaining, you know, in the habit of movement, maybe just walking to the grocery store instead of driving, just incorporating more movement into your life, it helps with insulin regulation. And I mean, that's really the common theme. Every intervention that helps, whether it's the sleep or the stress reduction or exercise or diet, they all improve the way the body handles glucose and insulin. So that's a huge part with exercise. And then the other thing is that exercise increases something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And I did a podcast with a doctor a while back who had the greatest line, and I told him I was going to steal it. He said, BDNF is like Miracle Grow for your neurons. So I think it's important to stay active. Now I try to be very accommodating. There may be people who are physically disabled who can't exercise. You may have a very, you know, an older loved one who's not, you know, it's not safe for them to exercise if they have severe dementia. So exercise isn't required. I do think the diet is the biggest part, but to the extent that someone can and will become more physically active, they absolutely should. So that should be part of it. But I don't want anyone to feel bad if they can't exercise. They shouldn't feel like this isn't going to work for them if they have a physical, you know, limitation. So, are there ketogenic recipes in my book? No, my book is it's not a cookbook because there's so many other good ones out there already. I mean, there's so many good ketogenic cookbooks that I just figured why reinvent the wheel? But you can search on Amazon. There's a ton of them out there. Does a ketogenic diet help reduce gout flare-ups? Great question, and here's why. So I did mention that chronically high insulin is a primary contributor to gout. You're probably used to hearing that gout is caused by too much red meat or too much alcohol or too much whatever, anything besides insulin, right? Gout happens when something called uric acid builds up in the body. Uric acid, and when it builds up, almost like the amyloid plaques, it solidifies into crystals. And these uric acid crystals deposit themselves into joints. And I think it can also like cause kidney stones or something, like it just deposits in tissue. And in gout, for some reason, the big toe is usually more affected, like people have really severe pain in their toes. The reason high insulin contributes to gout is that insulin interferes with the way the kidneys excrete the uric acid. So when your insulin is very high, the kidneys hang on to all that uric acid, and then the uric acid builds up in the body and forms the crystals. So when you get the insulin level down, the uric acid goes down. The kidneys are better able to excrete that uric acid. So yes, in general, the ketogenic diet does improve gout, with one caveat. When somebody is new to a ketogenic diet, they may have some flare-ups initially because ketones and uric acid compete for excretion. So all of a sudden, like before you're just following your normal diet, no problem. All of a sudden now, you've got all these ketones. Well, your body is not used to handling all those ketones, so it sends a lot of them out, right? That's why we can measure it in the urine, and so when the body's like getting rid of all these ketones that it's not accustomed to yet, that uric acid is going to build up, and that may cause a gout flare. But that's not permanent. That does go away, but people who have gout should be aware that they may have a couple of flare-ups. That doesn't mean the diet isn't working. It probably actually means the diet is working, and they just have to wait to make that transition. And believe it or not, the same thing is true of hypertension. I mentioned earlier that high blood pressure has almost everything to do with insulin, and in most people, nothing to do with salt or sodium in the diet. A very small percentage of people are sensitive to sodium, meaning if they eat too much salt, their blood pressure goes up. But for most people, you go on a low sodium diet and your blood pressure does not decrease. And the same way that insulin inhibits the kidneys getting rid of uric acid, insulin causes the kidneys to retain sodium. So when you get the insulin down, the sodium goes down, the blood pressure goes down. That's also why, lower lower blood pressure is one of the quickest reported things on a low carb diet. Not dangerously low. Like if your blood pressure is already healthy, it's not going to reduce it to a dangerous level. But if you have high blood pressure, it will start to normalize it. And it's all because of the insulin. And I feel like, I mean, forget Alzheimer's disease. If you guys listening take nothing else from this except the insulin, this is such an enormous issue in modern chronic health, and nobody's looking at it because nobody's looking at it. Like truly, nobody's testing insulin, and that's why this is being missed. It's why Alzheimer's is being missed when you could catch it 20 years before it happens. It's why hypertension, why you go on medication. Insulin is just such a huge factor here. I mean, insulin is so much more than a blood sugar hormone. You might think all it does is like help sugar get into the cells. That's one of the least important and least powerful things insulin does. It's kind of mind-blowing. Can I send the slides? Yeah, if you want to email me, I can send you the presentation later. So yeah, if anyone wants the slides. So am I missing anything here, or?
No, I think that's all, Amy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been very clear.
Amy,
Well, I mean,
Amy, can you hear me?
yeah,
Okay, it's Richard here. You know, you mentioned the fasting insulin test, that we could ask the doctor to do, possibly, but that you said that it might not be particularly accurate, depending on perhaps on this where in the cycle of of eating you were. Would it be better perhaps to deliberately have your insulin levels measured within a few hours of a meal that contains carbs?
That's a good question. Yes, probably, but I'm not sure how to go about doing that. I mean, there's something called the Kraft test, and it's a little known test that's becoming much more known in the low carb and ketogenic community in the US. This guy, Dr. Joseph Kraft, wrote a book called Diabetes, Epidemic, and You. And he's really the father of all of this. He's the one that discovered that insulin was really driving all of this stuff, even in people with normal glucose. And so the Kraft test, I mentioned earlier the oral glucose tolerance test. And the oral glucose tolerance test is where you drink that liquid glucose and they test your glucose like I think at 1 hour and at 2 hours. So it's a 2-hour test and they only test your glucose. The Kraft test is an oral glucose tolerance test where they don't only check your glucose, they check your insulin at the same time. Glucose and insulin, and it's a 5-hour test. Instead of only extending to the 2-hour mark, they test you for 5 hours. And that is very predictive for how you respond to carbohydrate and insulin. I have to say though, it's rare to have it done. You really have to kind of go to somebody that actually knows that even exists. You could maybe mention it to the lab, mention it to a doctor. They might be aware that it can be done. If somebody has been following a low carb or ketogenic diet for a significant length of time, you don't want to just go one day all of a sudden and have this test. You do have to carb up for like 5 to 7 days of 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrate. You have to sort of readjust your body to burning the carbs. Otherwise, if you haven't eaten more than 50 grams of carbs in 2 years or 8 months or whatever, and all of a sudden you drink 100 grams of glucose, you're going to get a false result. You're going to look like you have out of control diabetes when you're actually perfectly healthy. Yeah. So that's the one warning. But yeah, you can do it after a meal, but then you just have to remember that, oh, okay, yeah, I had a sandwich or I had some whatever, and that's when I tested.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a little bit imprecise, this, because in a way this is very exciting, the possibility that you can detect something as devastating as Alzheimer's. Perhaps.
Yeah, I do think most people will have an elevated fasting insulin. But if somebody doesn't, and they have some signs and symptoms of chronically high insulin, then they might want to look at that, trying to have it tested after a dose of carbohydrate.
Yeah, I see. Okay.
And if people want to know the units, again, I think The insulin units are an international unit, but if not, you'll have to just convert this to whatever units you use there. But we like to see it under 10. I think it's under 10. I want to say it's IU or milli, micro international units, whatever it is. It's under 10, and under 5 is even better for fasting. If you're in the double digits, you're a little too high.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting, because I mean, it is, it's so important, isn't it? Because the whole thing about cancer is that it's a silent disease, and that one of the sort of holy grails of cancer is detecting it early. And if we can do this with Alzheimer's, this is very exciting, isn't it? Potentially.
I think so, and it's such an easy test. I like I said, I truly think that this should be a standard part of the routine blood work. I think when it is, it's going to be a game changer, an absolute game changer. And I have one more slide that we didn't really, I mean, we have a little bit of time if people want to stay on the line. I mean, there are just some supplements that I think can be useful. Again, I stressed how important B12 and DHA are for the brain. And of course, it's best to get this stuff from food, if you can be on a good nutrient dense diet, but especially for someone whose cognitive function is already declining, then you might as well give them some extra.
Yeah.
And the extras down below, the alpha lipoic acid and berberine, those are there because those are very good for blood sugar and insulin control. So again, like to the extent that Alzheimer's is a metabolic problem related to glucose and insulin, type 3 diabetes, then it stands to reason that some of the supplements and possibly even some of the drugs that are good for diabetes may be helpful for Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah. Brilliant. Makes very much sense.
Yeah. Have I missed anything, or?
You got a lot of fans by the look of it.
Great.
That's great.
I'm glad people enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm sure they did. I mean, I'm going to get a lot of great feedback from this. It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. You're a real star, and we'd have you back anytime. And we'll try and get you over at some point in person to Ireland to talk to people, because everyone needs to listen to this.
Oh, I'd love to, yeah. And truly, like, if I recommend Dr. Kraft's book, That Diabetes Epidemic in You. It's short. It's like, I don't know, 80 pages. It's a really skinny book, and it'll blow your mind.
Yeah, I've ordered it already.
Yeah.
That's good, because I'd love to show that in the class. What an effect. You see someone perhaps with a youngster with normal, who's perhaps overweight, eating badly, but has normal blood sugar levels, and then behind it you show the insulin.
I mean, people that struggle to lose weight, especially if they're already eating what they think is a good diet, lots low fat, lots of whole grains, lots of fat-free starches, and they're exercising and they can't seem to lose weight, they probably have high insulin.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, doesn't it, really? That's great.
Oh.
I hope you've enjoyed yourself. It sounds very much as if you have.
Oh no, this was fun. This is much, I've done some podcasts, like nowhere near as fun as this. The video and the live interaction, very different.
It's much better, isn't it? Really, it's much more fun. Yeah. So there you are. You can start doing that. You can start spreading yourself out far and wide from where you live. That's great. Super. Now, that's great. I think we've covered everything now, haven't we? Really? Yes. Everybody's just saying thank you. That's marvelous. Cool. That's absolutely wonderful. I think this is, I can safely say, the best webinar we've had so far.
Well, I appreciate your evening, everybody. Thank you for spending your evening with me.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and it's definitely worthwhile. I mean, it's given us lots of food for thought, and the right. We have another minute or two. If anyone has questions, like not related to Alzheimer's, just low carb or ketogenic diets in general, Okay. We can see if anyone's got something. That. No, I think it looks like we're all full up.
All right.
No, it's just a lot of. Somebody said? Oh, Eva, what do you think of carb cycling?
Carb cycling. It depends on what the goal is. Not everybody needs to do it. Some people do very well with it. Athletes tend to do very well with it, whether that's like a once a week carb up or even every 3 days or so. I don't think it's required for most people, but some people do find a benefit to it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And there's another question here from Maria. What's your view on odorless coconut oil?
Oh, I haven't looked into the research, but from what I've been told, the refined coconut oil does still have the benefits. It still has the beneficial medium chain triglycerides. They've just processed it in such a way to remove the coconut flavor and odor. So yeah, for people that don't like coconut that still want those benefits, I do think that that works.
Okay. And Cecile says, hello, can you go on low carbs when practicing sport regularly?
A lot lower than you would think. There's some professional athletes who are thriving on this diet. If you do a lot of exercise and if you sweat a lot, you need to be really careful to get enough salt, enough magnesium and potassium. You really have to be careful to balance the electrolytes when you work out a lot. But I would also, for athletic performance on a ketogenic diet, I recommend the book, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance. And it's written by two of the world's biggest rock stars in this research, Jeff Volek and Stephen Finney, The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Performance.
Yeah, got that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. That's great. Thank you. And a relative of mine, 76-year-old, has stents and is on statins. What advice can I give at this stage, as I think he would be afraid to stop the statins?
Well, if they're not able or willing to stop the statin, I would still get the insulin checked, because chances are if his or her arteries were 99% blocked, they probably have massively high insulin.
Yeah, okay.
And how can we know if a person can't make phospho? I don't know. You have stumped me here at the very end. Oh no, I know what you're saying though. Yeah, phosphatidylserine and all that. I think if somebody had a real problem making that, that's more like an inborn error of metabolism, and that's something that would have been identified in childhood. That's something that that's a severe metabolic defect that you would have had major problems since birth, I think. I could be wrong though, but I think that's what.
Yeah, you're probably right, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right, yeah, because you probably wouldn't have made it if you couldn't do that, could you?
Yeah, you'd be like severely impaired from birth.
Yeah, exactly. Great. All right. What is it? One more here. Caroline asked, would you say one portion of carbs a day is okay?
I guess. I mean, it depends. It depends on what you mean by carbs. I mean, one portion of carbs. Some people cannot have a sweet potato. Some people can have 200 grams a day of carbs and be fine. You know, I still think those carbs are better off coming from, you know, starchy vegetables, tubers, legumes, beans, beets, fruit, than like cereal and junky sugar. So yeah, I mean, especially if you're active, you do have a higher carbohydrate threshold. So yeah, I mean, if you do enjoy a potato every now and then, or like even people that do low carb or ketogenic diets, if you're doing it mostly for overall health and you don't absolutely need to be in a ketogenic state all the time, if you go out every 2 weeks to a restaurant and you want to have a beer and some chicken wings or whatever, you want to have a piece of cake or something, it's really not a problem when it's truly once in a while, because, or even daily, if you're healthy and fit, one bit of starch isn't really that big a problem. The problem is that we wake up every morning and we have juice and we have bread and we have cereal, and 2 hours later we snack on a granola bar or pretzels, and an hour later we have a sandwich and chips for lunch, and 2 hours later we're having another snack, and it's this constant, ceaseless pouring of glucose and carbohydrate into the body. So once a day probably is fine if you're metabolically fit right now.
Yeah, I think snacking's got an awful lot to answer for. Well, yeah. You know, it's part of the culture that wasn't there 30, 40 years ago. And now I think, you know, it's constantly there. So people are eating all the time.
Yeah.
Constantly topping up their levels. There's never a chance for the body to move into a different state.
Exactly.
Okay, that's great. I think we've come to the end of it now. So that's wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you so much for Amy for giving us your time, and I think you've done a lot to clarify things for people and also to alert them in the first place. And this is a sort of presentation that people don't forget in a hurry.
I'm glad. I hope. I mean, I hope that I wrote the book to educate people.
Yeah,
so. And their doctors. Make your doctors read this book.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That's right. Yeah. Exactly. Pass it on.
Right.
And we will. We definitely will.
Thank you.
I'll be buying more copies after this.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Okay, and we'll be in touch again. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.